So one of the trickiest things we can do in Illustrator is combine it with the power of Photoshop. So before we start that, we do need to talk a little bit about finding good photos and a little bit of best practices and copyright stuff. So here's the deal. When you do a Google image search, you can use this content for academic use only, so educational use. The problem is when we start to do searches and just grab stuff and then repost it. That's not okay if we're going to social media, and some photographer makes their living off of that. So it's really important you understand that for educational use or fair use for documentary and films and things like that, there's a whole world of when you can use stuff and when you should not, particularly if there's any sort of profit or personal promotion involved. You don't want to just grab anything. But for school projects, that's okay. Just don't repost it to social media or try to, make any money off of it. Okay, so I do need to make that really clear. As we're doing our Google image search, though, if I go to tools here, you do see there is a rights usage. So this gets into things like public domain and Creative Commons. But one of the most sort of copyright lenient options is non-commercial use with modifications. Some will even say like you can use it for commercial use, but that's not an option here. But you can see we can start to get to stuff that would be on things like Wikipedia. Okay, so if I go to Wikipedia Commons, I could use this image, especially for academic use. If I go into that, you could see that in Wikipedia Commons, it might actually show me if I switch the languages, although this looks like it's actually English. I can actually get maybe a higher resolution image. So that is a good way to maybe, be sure that you're not going to step on any photographer's toes. Okay, so once you've got an image and you save it, right? So you could save image as, put it on your desktop. It's time to open up in Photoshop and crop this out. So I'm going to hop over to Photoshop and I'm going to be working with this image here. We're going to basically crop this out and copy and paste it into Illustrator. Okay. So here is the deal with that. So opening things up, it is nice that in Photoshop, when you go to recent, it will oftentimes have whatever your last thing that you put on your clipboard, if you copied, you might find that here, but you could always go to File and Open instead of File and New and pasting in. So if I go to my desktop, or wherever I downloaded from, yeah, you're gonna wanna pull that in there. Okay, so opening up that JPEG. All right, so we're gonna try to crop out stuff here. And it's actually a fairly challenging thing to do because he has a lot of different values along his edge, and the background has lots of different colors and values. So here's what I'm going to strongly recommend you do. Once you went to File and opened up your JPEG, the first thing I would strongly recommend is that you go to Image, Image Size. It's probably, in some cases, going to have it at 300 pixels per inch. And when we copy and paste it into Illustrator, it's not going to like that as much for just a straight up copy and paste. We could do a file place and it probably would be fine, but I recommend changing the resolution to 72 and then thinking about the document in Illustrator. How big do you really want this to be? So, if my infographics only 1200 pixels wide, I don't want to make it, absurdly big. So, maybe, we can squish it down, but maybe we do want to make it, 1000 pixels wide, something like that. Okay, so you got to think about how big is the document we're sort of targeting with this graphic. Okay, so the next thing we're going to do is let Photoshop do some of the heavy lifting. So for those who don't know anything about Photoshop, there is a huge amount of options. You can do animation, you can do 3D modeling in Photoshop, and of course you can edit photos. So I'm going to try to keep this super simple though. in general, here is your selection tool and or your move tool and all of your selecting options. And what these allow you to do is create what are called selections, which can be converted into what are called masks. And we can protect areas and make it a lot easier to sort of move objects around. So all kinds of things we could do with selections. The simplest way to probably handle this is to go to the quick selection tool, and up here you should see select subject. Okay, now you have some interesting options. I'm going to put on enhanced edge. It's not going to make a huge difference in this case, but I'm going to click select subject. So rather than like drag around this with this tool, okay, with the quick selection tool, this new option, select subject, is going to do a lot of the heavy lifting for me. And you can see I get this sort of marching ants, sort of dancing dotted line, sometimes called a marquee, but it's not super accurate. So it's missing this spot, it's missing this spot, okay? There's a lot here that I'd want to clean up. Now you can do that the old-fashioned way in Photoshop. You can use the same tool that we've got, and we can actually add and subtract to our selections. If you want to add to a selection, let's say down here at the foot, I could just click and you can see that it's going to try to grab more of that material. It looks like his knee got lost there, so I could drag over that. All right. Now you can see that when it did that, it actually created a bump over here. So I can hold down Option to subtract. Now, while I can do it in this way, the sort of newer, cleaner, maybe better way to handle problematic situations like this is actually called select and mask. So next door to select subject, after you've done like a rough sort of selection here, you can go to select and mask. And you can see right away, I'm getting a preview of what it would cut out, and it's pretty bad, right? Like it's pretty rough. So let's talk about some of the tools that you're going to want to work with. For starters, in select and mask, you've got this transparency here. And it's just another way to visualize what you've sort of selected and are going to crop out. So you can always go back and forth. Now you can see like this is a big problematic area. So I've got actually the same tool that we've been working with, quick selection by default selected, and I need to subtract this area. So I'm going to hold down Option and drag. And that's going to do an okay job, maybe in this area. But as I zoom in and get to other areas, quick selection tool could become really kind of dicey. So I'm trying to like paint in what I see there, but you can see it's like getting a little bit fuzzy, and hold on Option. You know, things can get away from me pretty fast with this, particularly if it's like tight corners, okay? So we're trying to avoid that, right? So I'm gonna Command Z. So one of the other options you have is to use the brush tool. And with the brush tool, you can kind of more intuitively paint in areas, or you could get like a really small brush. I'm gonna right click for that, or I could go up here and I could hold down Option and I could subtract. So I could sort of, just kidding, wrong tool, the brush tool. I could hold down Option and it's basically an eraser. Okay, so I can get really tiny brushes and like do like super crazy cleanup of like tiny little places. I'm going to strongly recommend though that you don't belabor that. Do not spend forever going around the edges, okay? Because in the end, people aren't going to notice like, is that 1 pixel off? They're going to be looking at the content of your infographic. Again, I'm just right clicking to make a different brush size, okay? And I'll hold down Option to subtract. You do have some other tools for other situations. So let's say, you know, this area here, which I happen to see is, you know, it's got a gaping hole in it. Instead of maybe painting that area in, you can use your lasso, and you can see that if let's crank this all the way up. If I draw a selection, there's also missing this part. If I draw basically an area, it will fill that in. So that's another way to kind of patch things up. If I needed to subtract, yeah, like I want this little area here subtracted, same tool, but again, I'm holding down Option to subtract that area. Okay, now we could spend an awful lot of time with these tools really trying to dial in kind of the general shapes, but don't spend forever on that, okay? Again, people are going to be looking at probably more of the data and not like getting too into, is that a pixel perfect image? Okay. One last little thing that you can do here sort of globally are all these refinements. So as I look at this, I might see that it's a little bit soft on the edge, or maybe it's like got that little bit of a dark outline. So what I could do is I could shift the edge in a little bit, yeah, and I can increase the contrast. Now don't crank it all the way up because you'll lose all your anti-aliasing. That's that soft little sort of blending between pixels on curves. Okay, so it's looking a lot better. And there's other places I might go in there and clean up a little bit. But in general, that's going to totally work. Yeah. So now that I've got him, what I can do is go to the very bottom where it says selection. Lots of ways we can crank this out. But again, if you're new to Photoshop, I want to keep this as simple as possible. So I'm going to say, I'm going to output a selection. And when I hit OK, I go back to sort of the normal Photoshop mode. And there's my selection, that sort of dancing dotted line. And all I have to do is copy and paste, okay? So I'll hit Command C, go into Illustrator, and I can hit Command V, and you can see that, this one I had it at a much higher resolution, and that's why it's bigger, right? But that way I can bring in Illustrator or Photoshop files into Illustrator for my infographics. Okay, and there you go.